Clear out your desk. You've got until noon." My VP didn't even look up from her phone when she said it. She just let the words drop into the middle of the open floor plan like a lit match, loud enough for every architect, every intern, every single person within 30 feet to stop what they were doing and stare. My name is James Harlow. I'm 31 years old. And in that moment, standing in front of the glass wall of Studio A with 32 colleagues pretending not to watch, I set down my coffee very slowly and said, "Understood." She finally looked up then. My VP Sandra seemed almost disappointed that I didn't argue. She'd been building to this for months, and I think she wanted a scene. She tilted her head, a small smile pulling at the corner of her mouth, the kind of smile that meant she'd already won and she knew it. "Security will need your badge before you leave the building," she added. "And your firm-issued laptop stays." "Of course," I said. I pulled open my desk drawer. A few pens. A worn copy of The Death and Life of Great American Cities that I'd had since undergrad. A framed photo of my younger brother at his college graduation. I placed each one into my bag with the same care I gave everything, deliberately, quietly, without rushing. What I did not place into my bag was the small black USB drive sitting at the very back of the drawer beneath a project folder. I left it there. Sandra leaned against the partition as I zipped my bag. "I'll be honest, James. I thought you'd be harder to move." She said it like a compliment she was giving herself. "You're talented. You're just not the right fit for where this firm needs to go." I looked at her. I let the silence stretch for exactly 3 seconds, long enough that it felt like something, not long enough for her to name it. "Thank you for the feedback," I said. And I walked out. The elevator ride down was 22 seconds. I counted them because I needed something to do with my mind that wasn't screaming. Not at Sandra. Not at the open floor full of people who watched and said nothing. Not at my former colleague and closest friend on the team, a guy named Derek, who I'd covered for twice during his divorce and who now found something very interesting to study on his monitor, the moment Sandra started talking. 22 seconds. Then the lobby. Then the street. I didn't drive home. I drove to a building 12 blocks south, a converted warehouse in the garment district that had no sign above the door and no listing in any business directory associated with my name. I had been renting the top floor for 27 months under an LLC my attorney set up back when I first understood what was happening inside the firm. Inside, it was organized chaos: 3 monitors, 2 whiteboards covered in timelines, and 7 bankers' boxes stacked against the far wall. Each box was labeled by year. Each box was full. I sat down, exhaled for the first time since morning, and started making calls. Here is what Sandra did not know about me. 14 years ago, when Harlow Structural was nothing but a business plan on the back of a lease application, there were 3 founders. My uncle Robert Harlow put in the initial capital and his name above the door. A developer named Philip Crane brought the first 3 clients. And I, at 17 years old, drafted the proprietary load distribution methodology that became the technical backbone of every signature project the firm would complete over the next decade. I was a kid. I signed what they told me to sign. I didn't fully understand what I was giving away. By the time I was 24, I understood it very well. The methodology, what the firm now called the Harlow Method and licensed to contractors across 6 states, was built on a framework I had developed independently before the firm existed. That documentation still existed. A USB drive's worth of original files with timestamps predating the firm's founding by 8 months. An old hard drive my mother had kept in a storage unit in New Jersey because she kept everything. And a provisional patent application my high school engineering teacher had helped me file at 16, long before I'd ever heard of Harlow Structural. The firm had been operating for years as though it owned something it did not own. And for the last 27 months, while Sandra had been systematically building a case to push me out fake performance reviews, manufactured complaints from clients I'd never actually worked with, a restructuring that conveniently eliminated my senior role, I had been very quietly, very patiently building a different kind of case entirely. My attorney called it a reclamation. I called it making sure I was standing on solid ground before I took a single step. At 9:15 the next morning, I walked back into the lobby of Harlow Structural in a dark navy suit I'd bought specifically for this occasion. The receptionist, a young woman named Becca who had always been kind to me, looked up with that specific brand of surprise that people have when they see someone who shouldn't be there. "Mr. Harlow?" she said, and then stopped, apparently unsure what came after that. "Good morning, Becca," I said. "Is Sandra in yet?" She nodded slowly. "She has a client meeting at 10. She'll need to reschedule it." I took the elevator to the 4th floor. Sandra was in the corner office. The one that had been my uncle's before he retired and handed operational control to a board that had since grown very comfortable with Sandra's results-first management style. She was on the phone, feet on the desk, laughing at something, the picture of a person who had finished what she started and moved on. She saw me walk in. Her feet came off the desk. "I'll call you back," she said, and hung up. "What are you doing here?" "You're not authorized to." "I need you to call Thomas in," I said. "Thomas Crane, Philip's son, now the firm's managing partner. And whoever is currently serving as your legal counsel. You'll want both of them here for this. You have 10 seconds to turn around and—" "The Harlow method," I said. She stopped. I placed a document on her desk. 12 pages, tabbed and organized. The first tab held a copy of the provisional patent filing from 2009. The second held the timestamped original files. The third held a signed affidavit from my former engineering teacher, now a professor at Penn State, confirming the dates of our work together. "The licensing agreements your firm has been executing for the past 9 years, I said, reference intellectual property that was never legally transferred to Harlow Structural. My attorney filed for formal reclamation with the USPTO 48 hours ago. You'll be receiving formal notice today, but I wanted to give you the courtesy of a conversation first." Sandra's jaw worked silently for a moment. "This is absurd. You signed." "I signed an employment agreement at 17. The IP assignment clause within that agreement references work product created during my employment. The methodology was created 8 months before I was employed. My attorney is fairly confident the clause doesn't reach it." I paused. "Your attorney is welcome to disagree. That's what courts are for." She picked up her phone. "Go ahead," I said. "Call Thomas." Thomas Crane arrived in 6 minutes, which told me everything about how fast Sandra's message had read as urgent. He was a careful man, the kind who listened before he spoke and kept his reactions close, but when he sat down and opened the document I'd prepared, I watched his face go through several quiet stages. He read the patent filing date. He read the timestamp documentation. He turned to the affidavit page and stopped. "James," he said finally, in a voice that had lost most of its edge. "How long have you had this?" "The documentation?" "Since I was 16. The understanding of what it meant for the firm?" "About 27 months. Why didn't you bring this forward before?" I looked at Sandra, who was sitting very still. "I was trying to resolve things internally," I said. "That option appears to have been closed." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he set the document down and looked at Sandra with an expression I recognized, the expression of someone doing a very fast calculation about liability and arriving at a number they don't like. "We need outside counsel in this room," he said. "Today?" "I agree," I said. "I also need you to know that this isn't the full scope of what I've prepared." I reached into my briefcase and set a second folder on the desk, thinner than the first. The performance review documentation Sandra used to justify my termination contains fabricated client complaint records. Specifically, complaints from a client on the Riverside Commons project who I can demonstrate was never assigned to me. His signature is on a complaint letter dated March of this year. He passed away in November of last year. The room went very quiet. Sandra's chair moved slightly, like she was thinking about standing up, and then she thought better of it. "There's more," I said. "But I'd rather present it to the full board than repeat myself." The board meeting was called for that afternoon. 6 members. Thomas at the head. Sandra to his right, flanked by a partner from the outside law firm she'd reached by phone before noon. I came with my attorney, a woman named Claire Oakes, who had spent 15 years in IP litigation and had the kind of quiet authority that made other lawyers sit up straight. I also brought a second person. His name was Martin Ellery. He was 73 years old, semi-retired, and for 20 years had been one of the most respected structural engineers on the East Coast. He had also been present at the informal review session where I first presented the load distribution framework not to Harlow Structural, but to a small group of engineers at a university symposium 6 weeks before I ever met my uncle. Martin sat down at the table, nodded at the board, and said, in the simple way of someone who has testified in depositions before and finds it unremarkable, "I've reviewed the original files and the filing records. The methodology James developed is consistent with the work I reviewed at the symposium in 2009. The timestamp documentation is accurate." Sandra's attorney leaned over and whispered something to her. She shook her head slightly. "I want to address something directly," I said, turning to the full board. "I'm not here to destroy this firm. My uncle built it, my name is on it. I have spent 8 years contributing to it in ways I'm prepared to document in considerable detail." I placed my hand on the first folder. "What I'm here to address is that I was terminated yesterday based on fabricated performance records, and that the firm has been licensing intellectual property that, as of the USPTO filing, is formally in dispute." One of the board members, a woman named Patricia, who I had always found to be the most careful thinker in the room, looked at me over her reading glasses. "What outcome are you proposing?" James? Reinstatement to a role reflecting my actual seniority. A formal audit of the performance review process used over the last 2 years. And a licensing agreement that accurately reflects IP ownership, one that compensates the appropriate party going forward. And if we decline? Claire answered before I could. Then we proceed with the reclamation filing and the unfair termination claims simultaneously, and the firm's current licensing contracts enter a period of legal uncertainty that its clients will need to be informed about. Patricia looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at Sandra. Sandra looked at the table. The meeting lasted 3 hours. I won't walk through every minute of it because the technical portions were dense and most of the real conversation happened in a side room with the attorneys while the board waited. What I will tell you is what happened when Sandra's attorney finally came back into the main room and Sandra followed behind him. She sat down. She looked at me, not with the smile from yesterday, not with the controlled smirk of someone moving a piece off a board. She looked at me with something flat and exhausted, and for just a moment I felt the strange distance between how I'd imagined this and how it actually felt. The board has authorized a settlement framework, Thomas said. Sandra will be stepping down from her VP role effective close of business today, pending a formal transition plan. The performance review documentation she submitted will be reviewed by an independent HR firm, and the IP licensing question will go to mediation before any public filing proceeds. He looked at me. Pending your agreement to a 30-day mediation window. I looked at Claire. She nodded once. Agreed, I said. I stayed in the conference room after the others had left. Not because I needed more time, everything that needed to happen today had happened. I stayed because there was one more conversation I needed to have, and I'd been putting it off since I walked in. Derek knocked on the open door 5 minutes later. He'd clearly been waiting somewhere nearby, which meant he'd been watching the meeting room, which meant part of him had wanted to know how it went. He looked older than he had yesterday. That's what guilt does to people. It moves faster than time. I should have said something. He started. You should have. I agreed. He didn't try to explain it beyond that, which I respected. There are 100 things you can say in that situation. I didn't know the details. I didn't want to make it worse. I have my own position to think about and every one of them is true and every one of them is also insufficient. Derek knew that. He was a smart man. That was always the frustrating part. Are you coming back? He asked. I don't know yet, I said. That was honest. Winning a meeting is not the same thing as knowing what you want. I had spent 27 months focused on one very specific outcome, and now that outcome had arrived, and the room felt different than I'd expected. Not hollow, exactly. More like the silence after a long noise stops your ears adjusting to what was always underneath it. I picked up my briefcase. I need to think about what I actually want to build, I said. Not what I want to take back. Derek nodded. He looked like he wanted to say something else, and I gave him the space to say it or not say it, and he chose not to. Some things don't have good words. That's fine. I've made peace with that. Outside, the afternoon light was doing what it does in early fall, coming in at that low angle that makes ordinary buildings look like they're made of something worth keeping. I'd designed 3 buildings in this city. 2 of them I could see from where I was standing. I called my mother. She answered on the second ring the way she always did, like she'd been waiting without waiting. I told her it was done. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Your grandfather would have done exactly the same thing." She meant the patience, the documentation, the willingness to wait until you were completely certain before you moved. I know, I said. Are you okay? Getting there, I said. That was also honest. I was in my apartment that night, somewhere between reading and sleeping, when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I opened the message. You think you came out ahead? Check who actually filed those client complaints. I stared at it. Not Sandra's style, she was direct, blunt, the kind of person who attacked frontally. This was something else. The grammar was careful. The timing was deliberate. Hours after the meeting, enough time to make sure I'd started to relax. I set the phone down and looked at the ceiling. I thought about the Riverside Commons project. The dead client whose signature appeared on a complaint dated 5 months after his death. Sandra hadn't drafted that document. I knew that instinctively now. She wasn't careful enough for that kind of precision. She was a bulldozer. Whoever wrote that complaint letter was something quieter. I thought about who had been in a position to create that document. Who had access to client records. Who had a reason. I got up and went to the third banker's box. I pulled out the folder labeled Riverside Commons Internal Correspondence and started going back through it from the beginning. Not looking for what I'd originally been looking for. Looking for something different. Something I might have moved past too quickly the first time because I was focused on Sandra. 40 minutes later, I found it. A single email. Forwarded internally. About a minor procedural update on the Riverside Commons project. Sent to the project team. Signed at the bottom with a name I recognized from a different context entirely. Not from the project team, not from operations, but from the board. One of the 6 members who had sat across from me today and voted to approve the settlement framework. I read the email again. Then I read it a third time. The forwarding was routine, that's how it was meant to look. But the forwarding had gone to Sandra's personal email, not her work account. 3 days before the complaint letter was created, I sat back. This was bigger than one VP with an agenda. Sandra had been a mechanism, not the source. Someone had pointed her, provided the tools, and stepped back far enough to seem neutral. I picked up my phone and called Claire. She answered immediately, which told me she was either still working or had been expecting this call. I need to show you something, I said. Are you available tomorrow morning? I'll make myself available, she said. What did you find? I'm not sure yet, I said. I need to look at it with you before I decide what I'm looking at. James, she paused. How bad? I thought about the email. About the timing. About the careful, quiet way it had been routed. About the message on my phone from a number that wouldn't trace back to anyone important. Bad enough that we're not done yet, I said. Not even close. I put the phone down and looked at the banker boxes along the wall. I had built those boxes to handle one problem. Now I understood there was a different problem underneath it, older and more patient than Sandra had ever been. I thought about what my grandfather used to say, the man who spent 40 years as a civil engineer, who laid foundations for things that are still standing. He used to say that the most important part of any structure is the part you can't see. The part that goes below grade. The part that holds everything else up without anyone ever thinking about it. That was also where the rot begins, when it begins. Underground. Out of sight. Long before anyone sees the crack in the wall. I got up and went to the whiteboard. I uncapped a marker. And I started writing names.